I can still see there's a few people joining, but I think we might jump in because there's quite a bit to cover off today. Welcome, everyone. It's fantastic to see so many of you online. Well, this morning, Sydney time, not necessarily morning for all of you. I'm thinking of you, Kate. I think we've had lots of registrations for today's session, so really excited to see you all joining. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which we're meeting today in Australia and in New Zealand, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'm based here in North Sydney, in the beautiful lands and waterways of the Camaragal people, and I'm joined by my fabulous colleague Sharon, who's in Melbourne on the lands of the Wurundjeri and the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. For those of you that are new to PBC, we're an organisation that provides evidence-based people solutions, and we've just celebrated our 35th birthday, which is very exciting. We've got offices here in Sydney, in Melbourne, in Auckland, and more recently in Dublin. We're proudly the distributor of Hogan assessments in both Australia and New Zealand, and we're also the publisher of the Hogan 360, which we distribute globally. My name is Jo Stamp, and I'm a director. I've been a director here at PBC for the past 10 years. And I work closely with our clients to develop solutions across the entire employee lifecycle. I'd like to introduce my fabulous colleague, Sharon Ardley, who will be doing most of the heavy lifting today. I just do the fluffy bits.
Oh, no, Jo.
Sharon's our Director of Practice at PBC, and her background spans executive level HR and consulting roles, both internationally and within Australia. And in her role, Sharon's actively engaged in creating and developing solutions to enable individuals and organisations to perform at their best. Welcome, Sharon.
Hey, thanks, Jo. And I just want to also echo a wonderful, warm welcome to everyone from some really fabulous sounding locations today. We have got what we hope will be a really interesting and certainly interactive session today. And I'll walk us through our agenda in a moment, but I'd also like to make mention that we really do want this to be as interactive as possible. We're going to be after your insights in chat, and to make today even more fun, we've also enabled you to come off mute and share your experiences as well. So we might be asking you from time to time to share some thoughts, and we would certainly welcome you to do that. If you're not speaking, again, if you could just pop your microphones on mute just to make sure that we haven't got any background noise happening, that would be great. And also, too, we are recording today's session as well. So we can actually send the recording out after today, along with a range of resources and support material too. One of the things I love about webinars like this and connecting with people on mediums like this is that we have a range of resources. And throughout today's webinar, Jo and I are going to be sharing some tools, some insights, and we really hope that that's going to support you going forward when you're looking at the wonderful world of succession planning. So we only have an hour today and a pretty ambitious agenda, but that's how we love it. So I'm going to take us through in a moment. I'm going to call it the word on the street. So, what's the market saying in the world of succession planning? So, what are our clients saying? What are we hearing? And I'll be certainly very open to getting some feedback from everyone on today's webinar around what are you seeing and hearing when it comes to succession planning in your organisations as well. I'll then take us through, why should organisations be focusing on this? And we've got some really compelling data, stats, information. So if you're thinking about being able to position the strategy either A, with your clients, or B, internal in your organisation, there's some really interesting research that's out at the moment that speaks to the importance of succession planning and the value that it adds to the organisation. Then going to launch into some best practices. After today, we have a series of white papers that we'll share with you, and we'll step you through some of the highlights of those best practices with some client examples just peppered in there for your interest. Another area that we're pretty passionate about here at the World of PBC is how do you measure the return on investment? So we've actually got some specific measurements and some return on investment areas that you may want to consider if you are building a succession planning strategy and a talent management strategy. There might be some insights there that will help you going forward. And then we'll wrap up with some resources at the end. So, an ambitious agenda, like I mentioned, but I think with a bit of interaction and a bit of engagement from you, it's going to be certainly a fun hour going forward. So let's have a bit of a wander through what we're hearing in the marketplace. Now, it's great to see so many familiar names on today's call. And for those who know me well, also know that I enjoy good conversation with our clients. And certainly, what's very topical at the moment is succession planning and the importance around that. And our clients are saying it's for a range of reasons. And one of those reasons is that there's a fair degree of uncertainty at the moment. So if you think about what's happening at a global scale, geo-financial, geopolitical, there's actually a number of really, quite interesting times. And that's putting a lot of pressure on businesses, not only here from an Australian, New Zealand, and certainly regional aspect, but also a global aspect as well. So we're finding that many of our clients are looking to really engage in some certainty around business continuity. And that really is what succession planning can support organisations to do. This is around identifying future leaders, it's also identifying future capability, and it's also identifying what are the most critical roles in an organisation that are most fundamental and certainly very focused on business success going forward. So that future pipeline of talent is certainly top of mind for many of our clients and many organisations that we engage with. But I'm curious to get a sense from you. Pop into chat. Do you currently have a succession management strategy or program in place? Just you do, Christian. That's great to hear. So Christian's responded with yes, which is great. Not really. A couple of yeses. That's really great to hear. A few no's coming up. And Joe, what are you hearing at the moment from some of your clients in terms of their interest and appetite around succession planning?
Yeah, I think, I mean, lately, yeah, wanting to develop one, I think that's probably, yeah, where everyone's sort of at. So probably what we see when we're speaking with our clients is, I mean, some organizations, yeah, do have, succession management programs in place, but generally, I think we're hearing increased interest in having those programs
Mhm.
in place. I think to your point around that sort of VUCA environment, I think organizations are actually wanting to have this as a risk management strategy. And I feel like a lot of organizations don't feel like they've nailed it yet. So hopefully today's session can at least give you somewhere
Mm,
to start with that. We're also
mm,
sort of seeing, continuously evolving as we scale up efforts.
mm,
And I love this one. We have a process every 5 years through committees that are set up. So yeah, it's
mm,
not mature and transparent. And I think that's it. I think we see people who just feel like they've got bits and pieces in place, but I don't know that
mm.
there's too many people that really feel like they've nailed it just yet.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. And certainly looking at some of the comments, there's a real mixed perspective here. Some do, some don't. And I'm just wondering, Michael Reed, if you're comfortable to come off mute and share your perspective. Sorry to launch into the very first person here, but you said about 6 months into this. So you're relatively new from a succession planning perspective. Are you able to share a bit around, how is it going for you at the moment?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the question there. Yes, so I work at GV Health, which is a public health service based in Victoria. We realised that, like many, that our workforce retention and risks associated with that, particularly in the context of providing a health service, are great. And so what we've done is that scalability, I think, is really important.
Mm,
We started off by building the framework to identify critical roles and then engaging with execs and working on the direct reports only at the moment, or roles that kind of would keep them up at night were they to become vacant in their own patches.
mm,
And then did that once we'd had those conversations with the individuals, then brought the executive together to sort of calibrate those and understand the linkages perhaps between those vacancies and the knock-on effects across just, in other words, not seeing a role becoming vacant in isolation of one another.
mm,
Now we're working on the development program to identify their individuals for those roles, the role readiness, if we like,
mm,
the pipeline, whether they're ready
mm,
in 6 months or 2 years, and
mm,
the sort of wraparound development for each of those. So it's kind of yeah, it was, as I say, it's been a slowish process, but we know that we need to do it. And working with an executive of group of varied understanding and exposure to
mm.
succession planning has been interesting as well.
Yeah. Michael, thank you for sharing your insights and being first cab off the rank, can I say? You've really set a high standard there. And what I'm hearing from that is that executive involvement, critical roles, the ability to identify that talent and the link to retention as well, Michael. Thank you. That's incredibly helpful. And what I find really interesting about one of Michael's comments there is around, the impact of getting executives involved. One of the other interesting aspects that we're finding at the moment in talking to our clients around succession planning is actually the fact that, traditionally it's always sat underneath the chief people officer role. And we're seeing a little bit of a shift in that space to the chief risk officer now actually holding the mantle around succession planning, particularly from a risk management perspective. And as an ex-CPO myself, I find that a really positive thing because the more people that really do lean into succession planning, the importance around that, I think is always going to be a great step going forward. And we know from a market perspective that even from a board area, it's going to be quite important around how the board sees this as being a priority too. And Gartner, and many of you would be familiar with their research, had shared recently that, in a survey that they did, 79% of board members absolutely see succession planning as being a critical element to their business success because there are certainly productivities and market variations as a result of that. So, if there was ever a platform that anyone needed to convince people internally that succession planning is an important aspect of business continuity, retention of talent, pipeline of talent, understanding critical roles, certainly 79% of board members would want to see that as part of a strategy going forward. And interesting to bounce off that, again, conversations that we have with our clients, sometimes even CEO succession can be a missed opportunity. And it was interesting that some research from AICD, which is this little bucket over here, had actually referenced that Australia's got quite a significant turnover of CEOs in comparison to a global standard. And I found that really interesting because, if you're thinking about a CEO and the role that they play, being able to make sure that there is some succession in there and that there is a pipeline of talent can be really important because certainly 54% of organisations from an HBR perspective were suggesting that there actually is a lack of a CEO successor at times. And interesting from a previous life of mine where I was actually recruiting CEOs into organisations, it was always really interesting when I would say to either the chair of the board or the recruitment committee under a board to say, do you have any internal talent here that could step into that CEO role? And it was surprising how many people and organisations would say, no, we don't. And if we do have someone, there are still some pretty interesting areas of development that they would need to focus on. So again, if you're not factoring in executive succession, but in particular CEO succession, we would encourage you to think about that because certainly most leaders see it as being important. And to Joe's great sage point before, some people are probably doing parts of it, but maybe not all of it. So that execution is going to be really important going forward. So interesting from where would we start and what would that look like? Often best practices is a great place to start. So I'm curious with your experience that you bring to the webinar today. What do you see as some best practices out there when it comes to building a succession planning strategy and certainly a talent management strategy? Joe, just while we're waiting for comments to come through in chat, you work with a number of really interesting clients, both in the public and the private sector. What are you seeing as some of the best practices out there at the moment?
I think Michael made a good point earlier, Sharon, around not just looking at roles in isolation, but looking at that sort of systematic approach. So it can't just be seen as looking at one particular segment of an organisation. So, for example, we see a lot of organisations start with the executives, and obviously the common sense place to start. But you actually have to look at the systemic view of the organisation and a systemic approach, I think, to succession planning as well. It's not just a here and now problem. It's looking at the future. It's future proofing the organisation. Like it's a much broader view. So we're also getting some information. The systemic strategic lens. and identifying the critical skills and now
Critical
being
skills.
ready. So that future focus, I think, is, we're all trying to predict the future. Who will know what happens here in Australia on Saturday? That's a separate conversation entirely. But it's, we're constantly trying to predict the future and trying to future-proof our organisations.
Yeah, thank you, Jo. And Barbara's come up with a really insightful comment here, and they're all great comments. But Barbara's actually highlighted, the best practice approaches I've seen start with organisational purpose and strategy and working out what type of leader would be best to deliver that strategy. Barbara, would you be comfortable to come off mute and actually just share a little bit more about what your thoughts and your experiences there were? Not sure, Barbara, if you've got a capacity to do that at all.
She said, "Give me 30 seconds."
But it's a really key point that Barbara raises around certainly that organisational purpose and strategy and thinking about what is actually needed for tomorrow. Now, here it sounds like Barbara, you're in the background there.
Yeah, sorry, I was just on the other side of the room.
It's always the way, Barbara. Share your insights, Barbara. What were you thinking of when you made the comment?
We go through at Corporate Wisdom, we go through a whole process about what's your purpose as an organisation, what's your idea of success, and what do you need to deliver on? What elements do you need to deliver on to achieve that success? And one of the elements is best talent, but it's executives and leaders of a certain style. We also use the Barrett model, 7 levels of leadership, because that tells you, and we work with the board, where the executive needs to be. Do they need to be a crisis leader? Do they need to be a best practice? Do they need to be transformational, et cetera, et cetera? So all of those things are pretty important. And not just at CEO level, at senior exec level, because that all contributes to the energy field that is the organisation.
Yeah, absolutely. Barbara, thank you. Really appreciate your comments there. And certainly that ability to work across the executive line is also really key.
Yeah.
And Barbara, you actually highlighted a couple of key points, particularly around that best practice approach. And there's actually a white paper that we'll be sending out after today's webinar on succession planning, developing organisational continuity and leadership excellence. It's actually authored by Dr. Lynn Cruikshank in our team. Dr. Lynn Cruikshank is our head of research, so big shout out to Lynn. She's on today's webinar, and it's quite a compelling paper where Lynn clearly articulates 10 best practice strategies, which is where you can see at the moment. Now, I'm not going to talk through all of these today, but there's a couple here that I think are really quite key. And Barbara, I might get you just to go back on mute if that's okay. Thanks. So one of those is actually, exactly as Barbara had mentioned here around that integration with strategy. And again, we're thinking about what's needed for tomorrow, not today. And that's probably one of the biggest starting points that we work with our clients on is what is the vision and certainly what is the environment that you're actually working in at the moment. And to leverage, again, Barbara's key point here around identifying those critical roles, where are they across the organisation? I'm going to share some tools that we use in a moment and some perspectives around that, because it may not always be at the executive level. And that's something I think it's really important to make mention here, that it could also be further in the organisation, level 2, 3, 4. It depends on how critical that role is to the success of the business. Another key point here is around that sense of talent identification, but also the assessment and the development of that individual as well. Because, we're looking to be able to develop those leaders of the future. And from a best practice perspective, that needs to be a fundamental grain in your strategy going forward, as is the importance around how you're going to measure the success of your strategy here. What is that going to look like going forward? Now, we've got some tips and ideas around measurement, but fundamentally it's going to be around what's going to be important for your organisation, whether it's public sector, whether it's private sector. Some of those measurements and those return on investments are going to be different for organisations and also the sectors that you're in as well. So building on that, underneath these 10 best practices, we actually have 6 guiding principles. And again, I'm going to touch on these, and I've got some more detail underneath to share with you at the moment. But the first one here is around lining capabilities. So as I mentioned, this is around what does the organisation need? What do you need for tomorrow and beyond? We're working with an organisation recently. They're actually in the public sector. And it was quite interesting from just a sector point of view around understanding what does leadership success look like from a public sector perspective, but also what is happening within that sector from the area that they work in. And it was actually looking at some of the trends around what will leaders need in the future going forward. So aligning capabilities and building those capabilities for future ready leaders was critical to that organisation. So spending some time with that analysis up front was really, really key for that organisation. The data component to any strategy is key, but if I reflect on even my own experiences of leading succession planning initiatives and organisations, data is absolutely crucial here. And this is around data that is reliable, that's accurate, that's valid, that gives you a really good laser view into the capability of people in your succession pool, but also the capabilities and the development activities that are needed. Rolling that into not only individual, but also cohort related reports will give you that sense of reporting. And in my experience of these, it's critical that the board, the CEO, the executive team are across that level of information and are across that level of detail, because it will give you that line of sight around the strengths of that individual, but also the cohort that might be in your high potential pool, and therefore where their development needs as a cohort might be required as well. And one of the things I think that's really important here is that development needs to be tailored not only to the individuals, but our experience, there will be some cohort trends, so some group development and OD initiatives there as well. Likewise, when it comes to measuring success, so again, starting with the end in mind, how are you going to make sure that your leaders are ready? But also, how do you ensure that the program, the initiative that you're putting in place, the strategy is delivering the leaders that you need for the future going forward? So these 6 guiding principles are also in the white paper, which we'll be sending out after today's webinar as well. So let's take a bit of a deeper dive. One of the key aspects, and it was mentioned in the previous chat, is around the identification of critical roles. And often we find with clients, where do we start? Where's the best place we can start in understanding what do we need in our succession planning approach and our strategy? Some people start with a 9-box grid, and I'm sure many of you do. Others start with identifying what are the most critical roles for the organisation. Curious to get a sense. Who is currently identifying critical roles, and how are you doing this at the moment? Joe, I know you do a lot of work in this space, just why people are popping in their comments around critical roles and how they are identifying it. What's some of your experiences to bring to bear here?
Yeah, I think so I think we're seeing critical roles changing. So I think we're seeing a much broader view of what critical roles are. We're not just seeing it as being traditional people leader roles. Obviously, they're still important, but we're also seeing those key subject matter expertise type roles as well. And it can be difficult, I think, to shift from focusing on an individual who's performing in a role versus the actual role itself. So trying to differentiate between individuals and the role. And I guess we're also seeing the emergence of new roles, as our workforce sort of changes, with higher use of technology, we're seeing, those more traditional roles changing and becoming new roles that are more technology focused.
Yeah, and that's a fair comment. Previously, for example, tech was always seen as being important. These days, it's often quite interesting to see CI roles and certainly some of the cybersecurity roles being seen as absolutely critical to business success going forward. It's a really key point. And Joe, we're just looking into chat at the moment. Michael made comment here that seeing some varied responses from current incumbents of high-risk roles, reassuring them this is about having a plan in place for those and not a sense of them looking elsewhere as well. Any other comments that I think are interesting there? Christian's commented, we started top down, top 50, and then we scale as we started to expand and reach deeper into the organisation. Christian, do you want to come off mute and just share a little bit more about your comment there, if you're comfortable to do so?
Yeah, no problem. As we continuously evolve in relation to our succession planning efforts, but we just try to keep it small. And we know we certainly miss some high value add roles further in the organization. But I see this as kind of as we grow up and become more familiar, exercise this muscle better, we can start actually having conversation much deeper in the organization.
Yeah.
Well, what I've seen done succession planning in different organizations, different sectors, you actually with the top 50, you cover a significant amount of critical roles within the business. And I always think about it, it's like those 50 roles, they should be known by our CEO. After, if you get beyond 50 roles, I think it's always feel like it gets pretty challenging for, let's say, your top person in the organization to know who is who. I'm not saying the others are not important, but I'm saying if you start from scratch, and where do you start? I think so we just do top down. Because if the organization is not very sophisticated in the process, you run the risk to get stuck very quickly just on critical roles.
Yeah.
And I see this more as a process of keep iterating, keep changing, keep asking the questions, because the strategies is changing.
Yeah.
Are there still critical roles in 6 months' time or 12 months' time? So it's not fixed. It's constantly evolving.
Yeah.
And this is how I would see around this topic when we talk about criticals. Ideally, we would run to succession planning for the entire organization, but you need to tech for this.
Great.
And yeah.
So sorry, Christian. I was just about to say thank you, and I really like your comment there around life constantly changes and being able to be across some of those changes and continue to adapt and highlight even more critical roles. Some roles may not become critical going forward. And I think that's an excellent point because when we're thinking about critical roles here, it's that definition of, what makes it critical. And can I just call out a great comment here from Ginny in the chat who mentioned that just started to build a task force. I love a good task force, Ginny, can I say, that's actually looking at roles from a 4-dimensional perspective around value creation, risk, scarcity, and future impact. And I think that's a really key point because in a lot of the work that we're doing with clients, we're looking at, certainly what roles are critical that add value to the organisation, and certainly what roles are critical that enable the organisation going forward. And that's a really key component. And it was interesting recently, a client of ours asked us to come in and facilitate a critical role analysis for their organisation. And it was really interesting how many of the executives saw, can I say, 99.9% of all of their roles in their directorate as being absolutely critical. That's not the case. Some roles are really important. Other roles are absolutely critical. And that is the key distinction that needs to be made here. And we're also looking at the role, not the individual. Okay. So it's around how critical is that role to the business success going forward. Because again, if we think about that risk management, that business continuity, you are looking for understanding the risk and the impact of that role is either A, vacant, or B, doesn't have a successor to it, or C, is not on your risk register from the point of view of being a mission critical role to the success of the organisation going forward. And again, linking it back to our 10 best practice framework that we had earlier in the slide deck, the ability to make sure that those critical roles are actually linked back to that future strategy. So again, the future focused direction of the organisation. So that sense of understanding how deep the knowledge is and what skills are required in that role. And one of the most important elements here that we always advocate with our clients is getting that multiple buy-in. I think Christian had a great line there around seeking that level of input as well. And it's interesting, there are there's so much interesting research out there around, is there a magical percentage of critical roles to be identified in an organisation? And look, my sense here is yes, but no, but maybe. And what I mean by that is some of the research suggests that, on average between 10 and 12% of roles are typically deemed critical. Now, again, that's some research from an organisation called People Matters. McKinsey says up to about 20% of organisations, 20% of roles in an organisation, could potentially be critical. Our view is it's actually more about the nuance for the business, the sector that you work in, the industry that you work in, and the crucial understanding of where those roles fit in as well. when we work with our clients, we have a framework. And again, I did say that I would be sharing some of our tools. Here is our approach. The key thing here is very much around consultation to begin with, understanding that level of bigger picture. So what are those crucial roles? And again, coming back to Jenny's key point around that value creation and what's needed going forward, that ability of consultation is really, really key here. And often not only do we run focus groups with executive to be able to make sure that there is buy-in to those critical roles, but we also pressure test that in other aspects of the organisation as well. So that strategic review is really key. And for some organisations, we also engage in doing some job analysis, because that helps us then create that success profile or that blueprint around the role and also what's required in that role going forward. And what we like about that, and certainly with the feedback we get from our clients, is that it's evidence-based. Okay, there is some rigor and some view around that, because it's also then important to think about, well, once we have that roadmap, we understand where the critical roles are, and they may not always be, as we said, at the executive level. There could be roles within the organisation that are absolutely critical. They may not always be the executives. So building on that is around leveraging data to understand where is the talent in that process as well. So key to get a sense of what data are you capturing when it comes to your potential successes. So what sort of information are you using to analyse, and what sort of information are you gathering on your your potential successes in your organisation? Jo, I'm just going to flip to you for a moment, if I may, because again, you do a lot of work in this space, and you're dealing with, quite a number of very large, but also quite, small to medium organisations who have some pretty interesting succession planning approaches.
Yeah, so I think in terms of data, I think, it really ranges. So it can be anything from, leaders in the business getting together and sort of doing a bit of a calibration session on who they think the potential successes are, and gathering a lot of subjective data, through to obviously a whole heap of more consistent and reliable metrics. Some organisations use obviously assessment to identify their potential successes and align those with the job, the critical role requirements. Other organisations, it might just be more subjective data, and it really does depend, I think, where you are on that spectrum in terms of how many resources you have available to you to throw at this, and I guess the level of risk that you think is involved in not having decent succession planning in place. So yeah, there's lots of different metrics. We've been doing, some of our people here have been doing some research recently on what the most predictive measures are. So there's some research around having a combination of sort of competencies, skills and knowledge. Those sort of three together are the key sort of trio. They can give you a lot more predictive information. But it's going to depend on the organisation.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. And we're going to jump to some data and certainly some of the assessment methodologies that we've been working with with our clients and their organisations as well. But one of the things I think is important to share here is around the importance of leveraging a data-driven insights. And again, if we're thinking about being, reasonably agile and adapting to what might be needed, again, understanding those critical roles. Some may be critical today, they may not be critical tomorrow. But then we need to understand where is the talent in that particular process. So accurately and consistently being able to measure that is going to be key going forward. And there is that dichotomy between performance and potential. So sometimes high performance doesn't always mean high potential. And that's often an interesting conversation we have with clients as well. Some of our perspective here that we share with clients is around, measuring potential as well as the performance of that individual. And we've got some tools here to support you in that in the moment. Being able to, really reliably predict the potential of that performance, that high performer, but also being really focused on minimizing any bias. So data is really key here, and that accuracy of data is really important. Again, I mentioned understanding not only from an individual perspective, but a cohort perspective. Where's the strengths and where are the areas of development going forward? And certainly being able to aggregate that data so that you actually have a pretty good line of sight to that bench strength and certainly what that pool of individuals might look like going forward. Now, many of you in terms of understanding and probably talent mapping are using the 9-box grid. Can you just pop into chat who is currently using a 9-box grid, or maybe even something a bit different to be able to understand performance and potential? Thanks, Nikki. Yes, you are. Jessica, yes, you are. That's great to hear. Anyone else using a 9-box grid or even something different? Thanks, Elizabeth, Samantha. Katie's using it as well. Kate Modicus, Christian is lovely. It's been around for a wee while. I think the 9-box grid actually was, I think it might have been out from the 70s with McKinsey, if my dim dark memory.
Yeah, it is. It was McKinsey originally. I like Lindsay reluctantly.
Reluctantly, indeed. Thanks, Lindsay. And look, the 9-box grid, certainly it has its place, and there are certainly some benefits with it. There's also some challenges with it. So if we're thinking about what might be some of the challenges in using a 9-box grid, what are your experiences? What are some of the challenges that you have faced in using a 9-box grid approach? Lindsay's got a couple of great laughter icons, emojis. Very subjective. Yeah, thanks, Nikki. That's a key point. Any other challenges that you face or have seen? Becomes political. Liesl, that is absolutely, that's a great comment. Any other comments? What are some of the challenges in using the 9-box grid? Certainly that level of subjectiveness, unconscious biases, get lost in the methodology, leaders understanding the criteria, perceptions, thanks, Lisa, a continuum, yeah, indeed. They're all excellent comments. And look, yeah, certainly the 9-box grid, it certainly has its place, but of course, yes, it does have some of the some challenges that go with it. We find that, look, it's a great starting place, and if you've got to start somewhere, it's not bad. But one of the things that we find in conversations with clients is that how many people do you see that actually end up being put into the future leader category? Okay, so often people with very high profiles often sometimes can bubble to the surface, and those who can be a little bit of the quiet achievers may not always be on people's radars. So if we think about leadership emergence versus leadership effectiveness, it can be blurry sometimes. And also too, not everyone is going to be a high performing, high potential person. So I love the comments there around it can become political. And it's interesting that some of our clients actually ask us to come and facilitate some of those conversations around, is the individual truly high performance and high potential? And how are you going to assess that potential going forward? The other part that I also want to call out with the 9-box grid is that there's often a lot of emphasis put on that particular quadrant here. And what often is sometimes missed is actually the underperformance component. And one of the aspects I really want to call out here is that in my experience of a really good succession planning strategy and approach, the CEO and executive team have got to own it, right? This is about the talent of the entire organization. And I think it's really important to not only focus on those future leaders, as we've talked about here, but often what sometimes is neglected is if there's a range of people who are not performing for whatever reason, how are the executive either supporting that development or that capability build of those individuals and cohorts? And if they're not, what are we doing to manage that poor performance going forward? So it does have its place. It just needs to have some rigor underneath it. So how do we bring rigor to the process is a great place to start. So many of you are familiar, obviously, with the Hogan assessments. And again, we're talking about Hogan in this particular call. What I find really helpful, particularly of that high-performing, high-potential pool, is getting a laser-like view around where are they in terms of their capability? Where are they in terms of their potential to move into other roles? And if we're looking at this particular graphic that you hear at the moment, this first 4 icons here is a great way of being able to understand the potential of the individual. So if we're thinking about understanding personality as a way of bringing strengths and also managing derailers and motivations of the individual, this is a great way of being able to understand, what is the blueprint of the person? And the cognitive assessment here just gives you a sense of, well, what's the profile of that individual from the point of view of how they think and how they critically think going forward. This is a great potential measure that work with our organisations on. The other part is around what's the performance of this individual, which is why something like a 360 tool is valuable, being able to get a sense of, well, what is the leadership shadow, the leadership impact here? And as we know, a really good 360 is capability based, it's reliable, it's valid if you use a really good tool here. Another one around understanding, what is the performance of this particular leader is, other tools, for example, such as the high performing team assessment. So this is a great one, another tool of being able to understand truly, what's the team performance like and how is the individual facing into that as well. Now, again, this is data that we're gathering here. And I think it's also important to just adapt it and bring in even more perspectives, and that's around some behavioral interviews around the performance of the individual against those capabilities, understanding how is the individual delivering on those business metrics. So what's their financial performance like, what's their customer performance like, which is why some of those biographical surveys can also add some value here as well. Joe, I just might bring you into the conversation here because I know you've worked with a number of organisations with these particular tools. What other insights would you bring here?
Yeah, I think just on the biographical survey piece, I think you might have a slide on this later on, Sharon, but it's around getting their perspective, but also just testing some of those assumptions that I think we all make. So, one of the things we use the biographical surveys for is understanding their own aspirations. I think where we can sometimes be quick to make assumptions about what people want to do within their career. We were working with a medical organisation recently, and it's not so much about yes, they want to get ahead in their careers, but it's from that sort of sense of altruism, and this is their duty as a medical officer, as opposed to that real underlying ambition. So it's understanding that sort of career aspiration area as well, which I think is part of the picture.
Thank you. And building on that, and again, for those who are Hogan certified, you'll be very familiar with these scales here in our Hogan personality inventory. So this is very much the individual from a personality perspective, the individual on a good day, what people will see 99.9% of the time. And I'm conscious of time here, so I'll move through this pretty quickly. Is that through the research that we have done, we've identified that there's actually 4 scales here which tend to really give you a good blueprint or a good line of sight into the potential of this particular person. For example, high levels of adjustment or the ability to be resilient is certainly a good indicator of leadership potential and success. Levels of ambition, which is around results and accomplishment, and certainly the ability to get things done. Levels of interpersonal sensitivity or emotional intelligence, and also prudence from the point of view of results focus, and certainly dependability and reliability as well. Now, if someone is high on those scales, they've got that natural ability. If someone's not high on that scales, it just means that they may need some extra development or some extra coaching in that particular space as well. So again, data is really important here. And when it's married with a really good, reliable 360 tool, you get even more information, because personality is around why we do things, and certainly a 360 is what is the impact of that behavior on the job. And many of you would be familiar with the Hogan 360. And in the Hogan 360, there are actually 7 competencies that are also a good predictor of leadership success here as well. And they're highlighted here in blue. So self-management, again, how the individual demonstrates that level of integrity and resilience in the workplace, people leadership skills, the ability to engage people, and certainly the ability to be very strategic and continue to deliver on those strategic outcomes. It's quite interesting in all the 360 debriefs that we do. It's not uncommon that very senior leaders spend so much time working in the business, missing the opportunity to work on the business or that level of strategic profile going forward. And we've got some really, compelling correlated data that actually says people who are high in those 4 HPI scales also tend to be quite results focused, and certainly high performance in that area as well. Joe mentioned that we actually also have some tools here around career intent and also aspiration as well. And so what's quite interesting here is, again, we're gathering more data from the point of view of a talent review and understanding the capabilities of the individuals, and also the cohort as well. So you'll see here that we've actually not only got some tools in place, but also some biographical surveys. And this is great and fundamental information to be able to gather that data on the individuals going forward, because this then gets rounded up into some reporting, not only individual, but comparative, and certainly cohort reports as well. One of the aspects that we have seen work incredibly well is the executive team truly understanding the capabilities of their high-performing high potentials, but also what are we going to be doing in terms of the development going forward. And we've often facilitated a range of these talent reviews where we can face in and lean into where are the most targeted areas of development that are needed, and also how we start to compare the cohorts going forward. The key here is that level of evidence-based, and certainly the ability for it to be reliable and highly valid information as well. Because I want to be able to make the mention here around the importance of that ELT focus. One of the things that we've seen work incredibly well is for the ELT and certainly the executives to literally form a talent council. And what I find really important about this is that there is a couple of strategic conversations throughout the year where the ELT meet and truly talk through those critical roles, and also the high performing and high potential talent as well. And so when you actually have that line of sight and an ELT that can sponsor some of that development going forward, in our experience, it really does get some traction pretty quickly. And so that ability to keep that on the radar and those reported reports that I mentioned before are quite key here as well. And so building off this is actually that importance around developing. So key to get your sense, what are some of the development initiatives that you are working with your high potential people on? And what are some of the development activities that you might be doing? And Jo, again, I might bring you into this conversation because I know you've done quite a bit of work in this space as well.
Yeah, I think it's so many times we see people who are identified as talent or a potential successor. You've got that sort of golden ticket, you get that label, and it becomes a so what. And I there was a comment, I can't remember who made it earlier in the chat, but so much time is spent on the identification piece, and obviously we're in the measurement business, so we love the identification piece. But it can't be at the expense of the development activity that actually happens. So you've identified through your measurement activity that this person has great potential. They're a likely successor for your critical role, but they're obviously going to have gaps. We've all got capability gaps. You're never going to find that person who's the perfect fit. Off they go, ready to go right now, no further action required. There are always going to be those capability gaps. So it's actually continuing to engage through development with that person. And yeah, I mean, Ginny, you've been very good on the chat, I must say. Some of those things that are coming through mentoring programs, stretch opportunities, targeted leadership development programs, critical experiences. And Sharon, I know you've thought through some of them that you've been involved with.
Absolutely. And so, Ginny, I just want to make mention to your chat here around cross-functional projects. Can I just say how much I love that idea? And we've seen that work really well. So again, 70-20-10, all of us are very familiar with that. It's, again, tried and tested. We know what it means. But again, if I'm thinking about the role of that talent council and the opportunity that they have to sponsor and certainly create some of those cross-functional projects, those development and those targeted development activities, it is absolutely fundamental. I'm an absolute passionate believer that being able to lift somebody up out of their area of subject matter expertise, move them into a completely different project is a really great way of accelerating their development. Why do you think it's a really great way to accelerate development? What would be your insights? And pop it into chat. Why is development even more accelerated when somebody is working out of their area of normal subject matter expertise?
And Sharon, in the chat earlier, there was some discussion around how do you, leaders who sort of become protective of their successors, or they become threatened about having succession planning in place for their own role.
Yeah.
And I think that cross-functional work really helps to build that enterprise mindset with succession planning. So it becomes an organizational level activity as opposed to just happening within those silos. So I think, you know, obviously, you know, you're building your skills and your knowledge and your capabilities, but it also builds that this is an organizational level activity as opposed to this is happening at the functional level.
Absolutely. And there's a degree of maturity, Jo, that comes off the back of that. So again, that talent council approach means that we're looking at the talent of the organisation, not just a directorate or a department. And I saw a great comment in chat there from Nikki that talks around that acceleration is because we understand different perspectives on other areas of the business. Absolutely spot on, Nikki, and thank you for that comment. The other reason why that acceleration becomes quite key is because the individual needs to actually lead. They cannot fall back on their area of subject matter expertise. They need to actually lead. And as a part of that lead, they also need to demonstrate critical thinking and judgment. Okay, so it's actually, you know, incredibly fundamental to the acceleration of that leader's experience, and also too, as Nikki suggested, they get an insight into other areas of the business. So those stretch assignments, I cannot speak more highly of. Again, coaching, mentoring, and certainly that level of professional development, peer learning, and certainly job shadowing are some of the more creative ways that we've seen development happening as well. So that leads us into metrics at the end of the day. So I'm curious, just in the couple of minutes that we have left, any metrics that you're currently working with to assess the effectiveness and certainly the success of your programs? What are some of the different metrics that you're currently using?
And this is what I'm really keen to see some responses on from the guests today, because I think we all know that we need to be increasingly able to demonstrate the value, material value from the programs that we're implementing. So yeah, how to actually measure that success is really critical.
Yeah. Indeed. And can I just say, Steve, I'm loving your comment there. Thank you. Of retesting 360. You're a man after my own heart there. Anil's also mentioned the percentage of roles filled by certainly internal talent. Look at the ready now 1 to 2 year successor for senior leadership roles and percentage of internal roles filled with identified successor. Katie, that is bang on. Thank you. Here's a range of additional metrics. Now, again, whether you're in the public sector or the private sector, some of these metrics will be nuanced for you, but it is around that sense of, you know, how many of your identified high potentials have moved into either A, more senior roles, lateral moves, acting arrangements. There's a whole range of metrics here, and these are just some of the examples and some of the metrics that we've worked with our clients on, being able to assess the effectiveness of their succession planning strategy and approach. One of the other ones that I find quite interesting there is things like improved employee engagement results, you know, productivity. Some organisations also look at the gender balance between people in their talent pool that have gone into more senior executive positions as well. So as you're designing the strategy for your succession planning approach, again, having the end in mind. Jo, I'm conscious we're almost at the top of the hour here, and I did reference some papers that we are going to be sending out after today's webinar. So Future-Proof Your Leadership, again, some really good insights into succession planning. Already referenced the succession planning, developing organisational continuity and leadership excellence a couple of times. And we also have some great research around competencies of great leaders. That, again, is a good read. These are excellent coffee reads, can I say? And it's again, if you want to reach out and understand a bit more underneath those white papers, Jo and I are also here to be able to support you going forward. Jo, before we end today's call, any last minute comments or insights from you?
No, I think it is becoming an increasingly big topic, and it is a big topic. I think that's part of the challenge, is it is such a broad, it's kind of that, where do I start with this? So hopefully today has been about giving you, depending on where you are on that sort of spectrum of succession planning, giving you some practical tools to be able to get started. So hopefully that's helpful. Really appreciate everyone's involvement in the chat as well today. It just makes it much more interesting for us as well, and hopefully for all of you. So thanks so much, everyone, for coming along, and happy Tuesday.
Indeed. Joe, thank you. And can I just echo, really appreciate everyone attending today. Thank you for your wonderful comments in chat, and to those people who came off mute and shared their experiences today as well. The recording and the white papers will be coming out to you in the next day or so, so look out for those. And by all means, we are more than happy to be able to have some conversations with you going forward. Have a great rest of the week, everybody, and look forward to keeping in contact. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
See you.